Hello and welcome to Bourbon Rocks. Tonight I want to continue the tutorial on bourbon. We started out the last video talking about different aspects of bourbon, different things that you might see on a label. And I said if I came up with a couple other things, I would do another video. And so it turns out I have lots of other things I can say. Plus, I also wanted to get into the history of bourbon, which I think is also very interesting and exciting if you like history. There'll be a lot of that in here. And so a couple of terms, we talked about single barrel and small batch and barrel proof and bottled in bond, for example. Some other things that you might see on a bottle, for example, are sweet mash versus sour mash. Now, sweet mash is basically the standard, which means when you finish the distillation and you go back to the next fermentation, you clean everything and you start all over again with the fresh grains and the fresh water and everything. And that's your sweet mash. But in sour mash, what you do is you take a little bit of the distillate left over, the liquid left over behind in the last distillation run, and you put it back into the fresh grains and some fresh water and so forth. And that gives some of the flavors back into the new mash and some consistency and so forth. Kind of like sourdough bread, but not exactly, because there is no yeast. The yeast is killed in distillation, so you don't have any of that going back in, but you do get like pH balance and some more consistency in the flavors and so forth by bringing that old distillate back in. And so that's what sour mash is versus sweet mash. Then there's also a couple types of stills that you can use. You might see column stills versus pot stills. So a column still is a continuously operating still. Those are the real tall ones you see in the distilleries, mostly used in large distilleries. Continuous column stills can be run continuously, essentially. A very large, tall, multi-story one that you see at Jim Beam, for example, what they call the hardest working still in America. That thing runs continuously 24/7, except for 2 days a year when they stop to clean it. So you could constantly just continue to put out alcohol. And that's for these large distilleries that can pretty much have 3 shifts a day and never stop making alcohol. Smaller distilleries, craft distilleries, are typically going to have more of a pot still, which is the smaller stills. Some big distilleries still use pot stills just because it gives a little more characteristic flavor. Pot stills mean that you're going to have to stop and clean it each run and so forth, whereas the continuous stills are just constantly going. Another thing that you might see on bottles is chill filtration. Okay, so chill filtration means that they take the whiskey and they run it through filter it through like a chilled, basically column, essentially, in order to pull out some of the oils and the fatty acids, which basically they will cause the whiskey to sort of cloud when it's cold. Like if you're going to ship bottles in the cold, or when you put whiskey on ice, for example, it may get a little bit cloudy, and the chill filtration takes that cloudiness out of the whiskey when it's cold. Some people like it because it gives a cleaner look to the whiskey. Some people don't like it because when you take some of those oils and fatty acids out, you're also stripping some of the flavor to that creamy mouthfeel that you get with particularly a good well-aged bourbon. You're going to lose some of that. So, purists don't believe in chill filtration, but a lot of distilleries do because it's more appealing to some customers. And then we talked about straight bourbon, for example, and we said that straight bourbon means that it's aged for at least 2 years. But there's a couple other things that you can imply when you see straight bourbon. It typically means it's going to come from one state. Okay, so if you see Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, that means that basically that whiskey was made, aged, and bottled right there in Kentucky. You could have straight Kentucky bourbon whiskey, which is distilled and aged in Kentucky, then purchased and taken out of state and bottled in another state, and they can still call it Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, even though it might be a product of Washington State, New York, California, Texas, wherever. But it's still a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey because it was distilled and aged in Kentucky, and just the barrels removed before bottling. If you're going to source whiskey from somewhere else and bring it into the state, oh wait, before I get to that, you can blend different whiskeys within that same strain. You could take two bourbon whiskeys essentially, and you can blend them. If they're both from Kentucky, you could still call it Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, but that still means that all that whiskey basically came from that one state. If you're gonna blend across state lines, if you're going to get some bourbon that's distilled in Indiana, for example, and then some from Tennessee and some from Kentucky, and you're going to blend them together, then you can't call it a straight bourbon. Then it now is you can say it's a blend of straight bourbons, but you have to call it a blended bourbon if you're going to pull it in from different states. If you're going to pull it from the same location, different bourbons, then that is okay to just call it a straight bourbon. But you will see a lot of blends. I mean, and there's this also a term called non-distiller producer, NDP. You probably won't see that on the bottle, but you'll hear about it, when you're listening to or reading about bourbon reviews. So a non-distiller producer means that basically they're sourcing their bourbons. They do not make it. They don't distill it, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's not good. Some of the best bourbons out there are actually sourced in. Jefferson, for example, was well known as a non-distiller producer. They source all their bourbons and then they blend them. So and there's the art in blending. Barrel bourbon, there's a lot of blenders out there that basically that's how they got famous and got their reputation as blenders. They're not actually distillers at all. So that's sourced bourbon that is brought together and then blended and so forth. We got a little bit into finishing in the last video, but I kind of wanted to sort of expound upon that a little bit more. We talked about how technically you have to make a bourbon before you can finish it, because if you finish it before it's an actual bourbon, then it cannot be a bourbon. Jack Daniel's is a perfect example of how the Tennessee whiskey process, where they filter the White Dog, the new make, through sugar maple charcoal, and then they age it. So they've essentially flavored White Dog or New Make before it becomes a bourbon, so therefore it can never be a bourbon. If you do it by the Lincoln County process, that's a Tennessee whiskey. If you do it some other way, it's just an American whiskey, okay? And you'll see American whiskeys, and I'll come into that just a little bit too. But if you take a bourbon and you've made it, it's a bourbon. You've met all the rules of bourbon that we talked about. And then if you finish it, it can still be a bourbon, but you have to say on the label exactly what you did. And there's even some specifications about being exactly in the same font. So for example, Angel's Envy, classic, okay? They take bourbon whiskey and then they basically finish in a used port wine barrel, okay? So that is a bourbon whiskey finished in port wine barrel. So you have to clearly state that. Still a bourbon. Some people get into arguments about, well, does that change it? Is it a bourbon anymore? But, by the legal definition, it is a bourbon, as opposed to Jack Daniel's, which is not a bourbon because it's finished prior to becoming a bourbon. But if you make the bourbon and then you finish it, you can still call it a bourbon, but you just have to clearly say on the label how you finished it, what you did to it afterwards, and so forth. Those are some of the other things, and I'm sure, again, every time I think that I'm done, I come up with all the rules. There's no way. There's so many things that we can talk about bourbon. We'll go on, and I'll probably have a few more of these videos that I put up from time to time. After I finished that last one, I was at the end. I was just like a little bit stumped there for a second. I know there's something else I want to say, but the video was getting kind of long, so I said, I'll save it for another one. So there's a few other things, and we'll come up with more as we go along, but there's a few other rules about bourbon or things that you might see on the bottle. I did want to get into the history and so forth, because I love history anyway, and since bourbon is the uniquely American spirit. Part of the history of bourbon is, of course, American history, right? So we'll go back to the colonial days, right? Back in the colonial days, bourbon didn't exist, basically. So what did the colonists drink? Well, they were making whiskey. They were making mostly rye whiskey. You know, again, you have a lot of these settlers coming over from Scotland and Ireland and so forth, and they knew how to make whiskey, and they were making rye whiskey. You get it, you know, being made in Virginia, being made in Maryland, being made in Pennsylvania, for example, so again, these were, you know, all American whiskeys. Okay, bourbon didn't exist. In fact, the true definition of bourbon as the legal guidelines didn't even come along until 1964. We'll talk about the national spirit and where the law was actually made. When did the name bourbon first get used? In the early 1800s, the term came up. But bourbon didn't exist back then, you know, so everything was, you know, American whiskey. Rye whiskey. Rye has the same rules almost as bourbon, just that it has to be 51% rye as opposed to 51% corn. You also have this small but growing segment of American whiskeys called wheat whiskey, like Bernheim, for example. And that has the same rules, just has to be 51% wheat, okay? You still have to take American rye and American wheats, you still have to age them in that new charred oak barrel, and you still have the same rules about coming off the still, going in the barrel, and bottling. I do believe that rye and wheats might have just a tiny little bit more leeway when it comes to flavoring and color. That bourbon is much more specific about what you can do. There's a little bit more leeway in the rye and in the wheat whiskeys, but by and large, same deal. They follow all the major guidelines of bourbon. So does Tennessee whiskey, other than going through that Lincoln County process, still has to be 51% corn, so it's closer to bourbon. It still has to be aged in new charred oak barrels. You know, same thing with the rye, 51% rye, new charred oak barrels. Same with the wheat whiskey, 51% wheat, new charred oak barrels. And then you have this sort of segment of just American whiskey, which really is pretty much everything else that is a whiskey coming from grain and aged in oak, but does not have to follow all of those other rules, okay? And then you also, if you get into this sort of blending of bourbons and rye, you might see something, for example, Bardstown does a great job of making different kinds of specialty whiskeys. And, you know, they might do a blend of bourbons and rye. So, you know, you have to say that. You can have bourbon, you can have rye. You have to say it's a blend of the bourbons and rye. So you got to make sure that you're not confusing the consumer. So, hey, back to the history. So back in the colonial days, what do we have? Essentially, we had rye whiskey, okay? And then you had brandies. Brandies were being made from whatever was available. The oldest distillery in America that's still in operation is Laird's in New Jersey. They actually have another operation down in Virginia. And they make apple brandy, okay, among other things. But apple brandy's been their big thing. And essentially that's supposedly the recipe was given to George Washington. And so George Washington at Mount Vernon was making rye whiskey. He was making apple brandy, I think some peach brandy. And they've just recently restarted the distillery at Mount Vernon. If you get a chance to go, do so. And you can taste some of the whiskey that was being made at that time. But you have to keep in mind, okay, that the whiskey was not aged in charred oak. So a lot of even the rye whiskey was still clear. You know, it was like rye white dog, if you will. As you know, I think probably some people might have been putting it in oak because, you know, oak was being used already in Europe and so forth, but it wasn't charred oak, okay? So, and you didn't have a lot of color to it. It was either clear or it was going to be just very lightly tanned and so forth. But that was your rye, and then your brandies would make, you know, apple brandy, but you could make from any kind of fruit basically that was available. And then what else did the colonists drink? Well, they drank rum from the Caribbean. There's a great trade between Europe and the Caribbean and the Americas, and a lot of rum came up from the Caribbean. And then, of course, you had brandies and cognacs and wines from Europe that were brought over too. You know, wines and cognacs and brandies from France, and it would come down, and sherries from Spain, and it'd come down through the Madeira and pick up some of the the Madeira wines and some ports from Portugal on that brought down with the sugar trade and so forth, and rums would come up to America. So that's what the colonists were drinking. All right, so now we go to the American Revolution. All right, American Revolution, the United States took on a lot of debt. They're still taking on debt. I don't know how we're going to sustain it, but this is where it all started, with war debt from the American Revolution. And so they had to pay for that. And so the federal government, basically, in part of the compromise, had the power to tax. And so they taxed spirits, okay? Brought in a lot of money taxing spirits. But that also made a lot of people very, very unhappy. And not too long afterward, we had the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion basically, was a violent event that occurred out in the sort of the western part of Pennsylvania and Maryland, Virginia. Of course, remember West Virginia and Kentucky, and we're still part of Virginia. But that we get over the mountains, you're starting to get into the frontiers. But Washington had to send in troops basically to put the Whiskey Rebellion down, and it remained unpopular. Jefferson finally did repeal the tax, but all that money that they took in, basically Jefferson helped to use some of that to purchase the Louisiana Territory. So now Jefferson buys Louisiana, okay, and that opens up that whole West. Now, around the same time, around the American Revolution and just after, colonists were moving from the colony of Virginia, as well as the new Commonwealth of Virginia, moving across the Blue Ridge, across the Appalachians into Kentucky. Kentucky was America's first West. Okay, that was the frontier, basically. So you have these Virginians and these Marylanders and these Pennsylvanians moving over into Kentucky, and they knew how to make whiskey. They'd been making rye. And now they said, hey, look, we got corn. Corn's growing here, okay? Corn, a lot easier to grow and so forth. So they said, hey, we got this excess corn. What are we going to do with it? Can't sell it all. Got to do something with it. How are we going to trade it? Getting corn across the mountain or, down the river, basically up to the East Coast. It's not going to last very long, but we can make whiskey out of it. And so they started making corn whiskey. All right. Now keep in mind, still not bourbon as we know it today. That's White Dog. That's your corn whiskey. They're putting it in some oak barrels. Okay. Now we got the Louisiana Territory. So we've opened up the whole Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans. Okay. And Kentucky actually has the most miles of navigable waterways in the lower 48. So a lot of these, barges upriver would bring this bourbon down, put it on the Ohio, come down to the Mississippi, come down to New Orleans, okay? And then from New Orleans, they could ship it all the way around back to the East Coast, to Virginia, to Philadelphia, to New York, to Boston, basically. And these thirsty people on the East Coast could get their whiskey, all right? Now, somebody along the way discovered that bourbon, take that back, that White Dog that they put in some of these barrels as they went down the river, by the time they got to New Orleans, they had gotten a little bit darker, okay? And it tasted a little bit better. So then they thought, what else can we do? Now, this is debatable, but a man by the name of Elijah Craig, you guys know that bourbon, okay? He's often considered by some people, it's debatable. You could probably find evidence to say that's not true, but there's some evidence that's true. He was basically a preacher from Virginia who had come over to Kentucky, and he figured out that if you char some of these barrels, you can make that whiskey taste a whole lot better. All of a sudden, that White Dog, which was a little bit tan as it went down the river in oak, now let's put it in charred oak, okay? Maybe it was accidental. Who knows? Maybe he was just a genius. But anyway, people in Kentucky quickly figured out that if you char these barrels before you put the White Dog into it, it comes out a whole lot better tasting out of the barrel than it went into the barrel, okay? And that's where bourbon was born. Around the 1820s, you first see some written reports of bourbon. Where does the name come from? Well, Bourbon County, Kentucky, which has now been carved up into several other counties, but this area sort of to the north of Lexington basically in and around the Lexington area, the bluegrass country. That was sort of what Bourbon County. Where did Bourbon's name come from? Well, from the Bourbon Kings. Interestingly, and I didn't realize this, so I went to Kentucky the first time. I just figured there were a lot of French names, like Louisville, obviously, Bourbon, Versailles, which is where Woodford Reserve is from. Versailles is, I pronounced it till I went there and learned, no, it's Versailles. But anyway, Paris, so there's a lot of names. And I just assumed it was because, that like the French trappers and the French settlers, that were like kind of out in the Midwest before other people were. But no, apparently after the American Revolution, the French helped the Americans win the war against the British. And so there was a lot of fondness for things that were French. And so some of these settlers from Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania that went out here to Kentucky had a fondness for things that were French. So anyway, Bourbon County, bourbon. And where else? Where did a lot of this stuff go? It went down to New Orleans. And where do they sell live in New Orleans? On Bourbon Street. Again, probably from the same Bourbon Kings in France. Whether it's a direct relationship through bourbon the whiskey or it's just they both have derived from the same original French source. Don't know, but anyway, so that's the name. So now we got bourbon. We actually have spirit, which is being aged in new charred oak barrels. And then you got some other people that come along. A little later in the 1800s, you got some famous people like George Garvin Brown from Brown-Forman. Okay, he's the first bourbon man to put bourbon in bottles. Okay, so before that, you wanted to have bourbon in your bar, you bought a barrel. Okay, now he actually started to bottle bourbon. Okay, William LaRue Weller, you know him as well, one of my favorite bourbons. He basically was credited with making the first wheated bourbon. Was he really first? Who can prove he's not? He's well known for it. Okay, but then we go into now, of course, the West has moved. Okay, Kentucky's not the West anymore. Now the West is out West and so forth. And you've got all this whiskey that's being taken out West and so forth. They drink in the saloons. And clearly, there's a lot of people putting bad stuff in this whiskey. And we talked about this a little bit before, the federal government comes up with the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And what that does is America's first Consumer Protection Act. That basically says that you're going to get good stuff because the federal government is going to guarantee it. So the Bottled and Bond comes from a single distiller and a single distillation season. They can't blend any of that stuff from different distilleries. It comes in and has to be aged for at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse. So the government had the keys and they made sure that it wasn't tampered with. And then it has to be bottled at 100 proof. So we talked about that in the last video. I'm getting long here again, so I'm trying to wrap it up. And that was the first Consumer Protection Act. So then bourbon basically is sort of like big seller. Ryes are still around and so forth, but ryes are kind of fade to bourbon. And then of course we have one of the saddest days in American history when Prohibition was passed in 1920 with the 18th Amendment, and from 1920 to 1933 when the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition, you got Prohibition. So you got basically a situation in the United States where it is illegal to produce, distribute, and sell alcohol, with a few exceptions. And the federal government did grant medicinal licenses to a few distilleries. Brown-Forman was still producing, for example, the Stitzel Distillery, which Pappy Van Winkle came to work for William LaRue Weller and took over that area. You had what was Buffalo Trace at the time, might have been the Stag Distillery at that time, but anyway, so there's a few people were still able to continue to produce medicinal whiskey, and you got prescriptions so that you could drink your whiskey and so forth. And I'm sure it was probably abused, but hey, listen, people need their drink. But it was obviously repealed. Again, was it because certain Washington politicians wanted their drink as well? Or probably because the federal government missed the tax, because taxes are back now on whiskey. They've been back for a while, actually. And there was a lot of money coming into the government, and so that revenue was lost. That's probably why Prohibition was actually repealed. And then we get into the war, federal government takes over production because of the war products. I don't know the name of that, but we're basically the government had ability to control industrial production. They wanted industrial alcohol more than drinking alcohol. And then we get into the post-war boom. And now bourbon just goes big again. You've got, the 50s and stuff. You've got Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, pushing, bourbon and so forth. So it's a big national spirit again. Early 60s, still big. 1964 is when the federal government did pass the act which made bourbon the national spirit and made the rules that we have today. They've been modified a bit as time goes on, but basically that was where it all had to be made in the United States, and the mash bill and the new charter container rules. And then came the bourbon bust. Okay, now the bourbon bust from late 60s, 70s into the 80s, basically that's when clear spirits like vodka and gin became very popular, cocktails became very popular, and bourbon went into a recession. I like to say I grew up drinking bourbon my whole life. I never knew there was a bourbon bust because I drank it. All my friends drank it, So, Jim Beam, obviously Wild Turkey, and Jack Daniels, which technically, as we said, is not a bourbon, but, it's Tennessee whiskey, so it often gets lumped in with bourbons because it's got many of the same rules. So I never knew there was a bourbon bust, but there was. But then you start out. Now we get into the later 80s, you start to see some new things coming out. In 1984, Blanton's was the first single barrel bourbon. Get into the 90s, now you start seeing this resurgence again. Pappy starts winning these awards, okay? 99 out of 100, by these tasting panels. And then you get into the 2000s, and now we've had the bourbon renaissance, and you can see now bourbon is everywhere again. It's back to being, vodka still outsells because vodka is still used in cocktails and so forth, but certainly for a sipping liquor, a just drinking neat, then nothing's going to touch bourbon's the big. So rye rye pretty much died off, never came back after Prohibition for years. There were only one or two actually ryes out there. Rye's made a resurgence in the past few years as well. Because of especially its use in cocktails, it's that spicier flavor tends to blend itself well with sweeter cocktails and so forth. So anyway, now we are today at the bourbon renaissance, and that's why I'm doing this. I'm going to do one more introductory video. I'm going to talk about basically tasting bourbon and how I do it. And for the first time, I'm actually going to turn the camera over there. I'm going to show you the wall that I keep all my bourbon in. There's a couple pictures on the website, and then just talk about how we taste and nose bourbons, and just a little thing about creating flights and that kind of stuff. So, all right. Again, this one got longer. I thought I cut the last video short because I didn't want to go too long, and I left some things unsaid. I wanted to get them in there, but I wanted to also get into the history because I love American history. I love bourbon history, and American history is bourbon history because bourbon is America. So anyway, thank you very much. Check out the rest of our videos and our actual tastings on bourbonrocks.com.